Hello everyone. So this is a video that's actually on a request of a friend, Richie. He has stated that he has an interest in Victorian Britain and a lot of the culture and history of that time, and he's requested that I make a video about it. Rather than making a video about the whole century, which would definitely not fit into one video, I've decided to focus on one particular decade, the 1880s. So just talk a little bit about that. Obviously I can't fit everything in here, I'm sure Richie will understand. But I'm going to cover some of the main sort of themes of that decade. So, Britain in the 1880s. This is sort of the back end of the Industrial Revolution. That is to say, the Industrial Revolution had already been going on since roughly the 1750s. So the 1880s was sort of, we were already industrialised by that point. But there were many big industrial British cities like Manchester, Leeds, Birmingham, Glasgow. In fact, Glasgow was known as the second city of the empire at that point, not Birmingham. Today Birmingham's our second biggest city, but in Victorian Britain, Glasgow was known as the second city of the empire. This year they're going to hold the Commonwealth Games, incidentally. But in regards to the decade, for me one of the most striking things, and I'll cover this earlier in the video because I do have quite a strong personal interest in it, is the Jack the Ripper case, better known as the Whitechapel murders, or at least wider known as the Whitechapel murders. I say wider known because generally only 5 murders are directly attributed to Jack, to give him his acronym, and 11 murders altogether. Now, this is a subject that interests me, and I'd like to make a video specifically on that, so I'm just going to touch on it here. I guess you could call it somewhat of a morbid subject, because we're talking about vulnerable women who were murdered in cold blood in a very heinous way, but the fact is, it remains one of the world's most, let's say, intriguing murder cases, and it is true that because it was never solved, there's always going to be an element of mystery and intrigue there. Even if they do find out who's done it, I strongly believe that it will never really rest, because even if someone does reveal the actual killer, someone else will just say, oh no, that can be disproven. You know, I've studied the Ripper case quite a lot, and I have my own views and feelings on it, but frankly it would be, I just couldn't put it all in this video. But it's certainly an interesting case. It's I've been to the sites where those women were murdered, but it is more actually than just a murder case. It's actually symbolic of the London of the time. You know, London was the centre of the British Empire, and the British Empire at the time was a world superpower. So essentially London was the centre of the universe. But London was a tale of two cities. I strongly recommend a book called, I think it's The Blackest Streets. Bear with me 1 second and I'll find out the author of that book. Just 1 second. Still there? Still there, my loyal viewers? Thank you for waiting. I don't usually do that, but I didn't want to just go and make another video. Sarah Wise, The Blackest Streets. I really recommend that book. It does touch on the Whitechapel murders, but it also covers an area called the Old Nickel, which was one of London's worst slums, and London really was a tale of two cities. Arguably it's not that different today. I mean, if you look at the economic difference between Tower Hamlets and, for example, Chelsea, or Kensington, and my mind's blank now, the full name of the borough, Kensington and Chelsea, I think. Yeah, that's the full name of the borough. The economic difference is still profound today, and just like today, there was rampant crime, there was severe poverty, although the life expectancy then was a lot shorter. I believe an adult in the East End could expect to live, I saw somewhere, 27. Now, I don't know if that's accurate, but if it is, that's even worse in developing countries today. So, truly a tale of two cities. and there's a cruel irony about the British Empire in that sense. Now, I'm someone, incidentally, I can't talk about 1880s Britain without mentioning the Empire. I'm someone who's long believed that great nations should admit their past and be honest about moral flaws. And there's absolutely no question about it. There's many areas of the British Empire that should be critiqued. We did exploit people, we were greedy, and there's some things that can never be justified. Nevertheless, I don't accept that it was all bad. Britain made the modern world, and the Empire was very influential in that. We did spread the Industrial Revolution, and I just don't accept that something as big and influential as the British Empire was all bad. Yes, the agenda of the Empire and the intentions may have been selfish, but the byproduct of the Empire, I don't accept it was all bad. And that's not jingoistic bias. I just think something that big cannot be called entirely bad. It's a bit like communism in China is massively influential, and I think it's predominantly negative force. I think it's repressive, etc. But there are some good things that came with communism, particularly for women. So the reason I'm making that analogy is because an ideology or a situation as big as the largest empire the world has ever seen, you can't simply dismiss it as bad. I think that's lazy, academic laziness in a sense. So I couldn't make a video about 1880s Britain without mentioning the empire. As a result of the empire, at that time we were involved in several colonial wars. The Anglo-Sudan Wars, or also known as the Mahdi Wars. One of the most famous incidents of the decade was the death of General Gordon in Khartoum in 1882. That's an event that's been depicted in art, quoted many times. It was seen as a dark moment for the British. Gordon was sort of seen as a war hero. In terms of politics of the time, the two dominant political figures were William Gladstone and the Marquess of Salisbury, the third Marquess of Salisbury, also known as Lord Salisbury. Disraeli at this time was, I believe Disraeli died in 1882, so I'm focusing specifically here on the 1880s decade. Cars, as in the automobile, was in its very early pioneering stage. Now, it would be wrong to give us entire credit for that. France, I believe, could also claim a lot of credit for developing the automobile. Railways by this point were well established. They'd been sort of developed in the 1830s, 1840s, so railways were they weren't a new thing. They were up and running, and railways were very important in this country. Electricity, I believe, Thomas Edison, this was the decade that Thomas Edison really pioneered his projects, and I believe it was Salisbury who was the first Prime Minister to use electricity in Downing Street, but don't quote me on that, it may have been Gladstone. Both men, Gladstone and Salisbury, were very influential. Gladstone especially is seen as a titan of British politics, generally seen as one of our best Prime Ministers ever. The issue of Home Rule in Ireland was a very hot subject of the time. You had a range of Fenian attacks which sort of preceded the IRA, and sometimes these were deadly attacks. Basically they were the first terrorist attacks that we saw in London in terms of how we define modern day terrorism. What else can be said about the decade? Queen Victoria celebrated her Diamond Jubilee. Correction, my mistake. Her Silver Jubilee in 1887. Her Diamond Jubilee was 1897. But it was in that decade that she started to come out of the shadows. For years she'd been living in the wilderness. Benjamin Disraeli deserves credit for helping her to sort of come out of the shadows. She'd been known as the Widow of Windsor, and there was a bit of public resentment that she was a distant figure, and but by the time of her Golden Jubilee I've made a mistake. Her Silver Jubilee would have been 1877, Golden Jubilee 1887, Diamond Jubilee 1897, just to clarify that. Fashion I can't say much about because that's not an area I follow very much. Charles Dickens' works were still very popular, but he died in 1870. So by the 1880s, the major literary force was Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes, which really needs no explanation. One thing I should mention is photography. That was it had already been pioneered, but it was really starting to take off by this point. And something Richie, my friend, mentioned to bring this into the video. The Victorians had a very intriguing attitude to death, and it was very common for the Victorians to photograph dead children. I believe this was called I made this video sort of on the spur. I'll look up the exact term. It was basically when children were photographed after death. Now, by today's standards, this would be seen as quite morbid. But the Victorian attitude to death was very, by today's standards it would be seen as morbid, but that is how the Victorians dealt with things. And you'd have photographs of not just children, adults as well, actually posed days after their death. I saw something recently, actually, a boxer in Mexico, I believe, who died, who was murdered. He was put upright in a ring. It reminded me a bit of this. Slightly morbid, but I think it's wrong to be too judgmental of the Victorians. And this is another area I'd like to touch on. Often today we vilify the Victorians as being rigid, as being without fun, as being brutal and stoic. But you have to acknowledge that the Victorians, in many ways, were a lot more humane and a lot more progressive than previous decades. Take, for example, mental health care. Now, by today's standards, it would have been much crueler and much more inhumane. Nevertheless, the Victorians did take a more progressive attitude than the Georgians. The Georgian attitude was to just poke fun at them. The Victorians did genuinely recognise it as a medical condition that needed to be treated. Also, public executions were abolished in Britain in 1868, although I have to say it was more to do with crowd safety rather than moral issues. We still had the death penalty, but it was in private. Now compare that to a lot of countries around the world where the death penalty continues to this day in public. So that was a progressive step in the right direction. Victorian prisons were very regimented, a lot stricter than they are today. In fact, it's a point worth mentioning that most of today's prisons in Britain do date from the Victorian era. Actually, what I'm going to do is put a link in this video. It's simply called Postmortem Photography. Memento-mori. That's it. Memento-mori. This was used all over the world, but it was particularly popular in Britain. This idea of photographing people after death. One more area that personally interests me is Pre-Raphaelite art. Now, the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood were a group of artists who believed that art should, they sort of rebelled against the Royal Academy, and they believed that art should go back to romanticism of a time before Raphael, hence the name. But their influence, they only lasted for 3 or 4 years, but their influence lasted much longer. And if you look at Pre-Raphaelite art, it tended to focus a lot on Greek and Roman mythology and Arthurian legend, which is another area I'm very interested in. And the Victorians, when we had imperial might in Britain, they tended to sort of model themselves on the Roman Empire. They also, like all empires do, they use sort of moral high ground from their perspective. That's not my words, that's their perspective. I have a postcard, I'll just bring it up actually. This is interesting. I got this in Leeds Art Gallery. I'll try and hold this up to the camera. Can you see that? Now that's a bit earlier than the period I'm talking about. That picture's from 1858, which is the year after the Indian Mutiny. I'll hold it once again. Now you'll see there's a woman at the bottom holding a child, a dead woman, and then you have this powerful Britannia figure who's sort of an analogy of a powerful warrior queen slaying a tiger, tiger representing India. The Indian Mutiny, of course, was a very infamous event. Indians call it the First War of Indian Independence, although that name is contentious because India was not a unified state. But in a way that sort of shows the Victorian attitude to empire. And I'll have to wrap up there. Thank you for watching.